What is the difference between craft and art? This lecture will look at the difference between art and craft and attempts to reunite art and craft in recent times. We'll look at the question of whether or not it even matters if a work is well crafted, and whether or not it matters if an artist crafts his or her own work, or has other people do it, or machines do it. We'll pay particular attention to the medium of sculpture as we ask these questions. So to get into what craft is, before the Enlightenment, there was no difference between an artist and a craftsperson. So if you look at these works of art, we don't know who the artists were. We don't have the names of the individuals who made these things. The artist was a craftsperson working in service to a community, as you can see in these examples. Take, for example, the Gothic cathedrals. The multimedia art of the 12th century was stained glass. Developments in architecture were what made it possible for these walls to dissolve almost entirely into glass. How was this so? The pointed arch helped. It was better than the regular old arch in bearing weight, and the flying buttresses that are on the outside of this building of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, they took the weight of the building and distributed it outside of the walls, which meant that glass did not need to bear the load of the building. Thus, more glass was possible, more glass on the walls. Stained glass told the stories of the faith, and the light coming through the glass created an experience for the religious participant. The light was a metaphor for the way that God's divine light radiates through all created matter. God's beauty is present throughout the world. Just as light passes through stained glass, God's light is present in all created things. And the craftsperson is the person who makes this possible, who has or at least makes it possible for us to see that this is happening. The craftsperson is the one who's transforming inert material, such as glass or stone, into something with rational meaning, something with meaning. Irrational matter takes on rational meaning. This stained glass was not seen in a museum. It was part of the architecture. It could only have been seen in its context. It can still only be seen in its context. This art was not divorced from the community in which it's made, or the rituals that the community is performing, the religious rituals. The artist is not divorced from that community either. The artist is not divorced from the community for which he produces the works. So if you remember the different functions of art that we discussed, we talked about persuasion. That would be one reason for stained glass. They often tell stories. It's religious stories meant to persuade. And it can also be made for delight and also for religious ritual. But in this case, stained glass, at least at this time in the 12th century, was not made for self-expression. We do not know the individual desires or needs of the artist making this stained glass. So self-expression was not a primary function of these stained glass masterpieces. And even during the Renaissance, the artist was still a craftsperson who was commissioned by patrons. But during the Renaissance, the role of the artist was beginning to change. The artist was beginning to be considered an individual genius. Now we know the name of the artist, Michelangelo, obviously. By the 18th century, crafts were separated from fine art. Painting and sculpture were considered fine art, while other arts were seen as crafts. They were made for the mere functionality, for mere functional purposes, and thus they were less important because they were functional. Whereas before, as you saw with the stained glass, the functionality was not divorced, was not separated from the beauty of the work. Now it's as if function is less important. Even Michelangelo is a genius of the Renaissance, but his work is still in the service of the church. This idea that art is separate from function and is something separate from everyday life was not always the case. It doesn't have to be that way. So turning to sculpture for a moment, this is an example of the technique of carving. Marble, he carves in marble. It's a technique highlighted in your text. We can see here the chisel marks. And so it gives us a sense of how he made this work. And along with carving, your text also highlights casting as a sculptural process. Casting involves using a mold and filling it with something. Hot metal is heated to thousands of degrees and poured into the mold. Artists would often sculpt in clay or wax, and then create the mold around the clay sculpture. And then the original clay or wax sculpture is removed, and then that empty space is filled with the hot metal, and that's a more permanent material, so much more long-lasting. So some examples of things that were cast would be this bronze by Kiki Smith, and Corporate Wars, cast aluminum. So the artist made a mold and poured that hot aluminum into that mold to create this piece. Another artist who does casting is Charles Ray, and another would be Rachel Whiteread. She's actually casting resin. She makes empty spaces present by casting these empty spaces in resin, so she's making them solid. This is in the interior of a beehive. It's an empty space. It's as if a space that doesn't exist, but she makes it exist by casting it. So she's taking those negative spaces that we might overlook or disregard and giving them a presence for us to observe. So casting, there's carving and there's casting, and there's also assembled sculpture, crafted through assembling different objects together, whether that's found objects or metal or wood. And so to get back to our question about art and craft, Michelangelo's work is made for a religious context, and sculpture in context is different than sculpture taken out of context and put in a museum. So seen in a museum, you have a different experience with the work. But today, artists make art intended to be seen in the museum. Obviously, this is made for the museum. You wouldn't want to look at it anywhere else. Same with this piece. It looks like the back of a truck, but it's actually made on canvas, painted on canvas. There would be nowhere to look at this except in a museum. If you threw this on the side of your house, it would just look like a piece of junk. So in the museum, it takes on a different meaning, a different purpose. Same with this sculpture. Michelangelo preferred sculpture to painting. And even though he painted the Sistine Chapel, as we all know, he hated doing so. So what is it that makes sculpture unique? Well, sculpture allows us to walk around the art object. It allows for multiple viewpoints. So every position along the way, as you step around this sculpture, will look different. There's an infinite number of viewpoints. And this inherent characteristic of sculpture is capitalized on by installation art. And this is a huge public art work, but a more traditional installation art allows viewers to be immersed in the work. They move through the work, and every step offers a new point of view. The viewer is a necessary part of the work because the work is finished by the viewer's engagement with it. The work is not on its own. It can't exist on its own autonomously without the viewer. And the work becomes time-based, since one must take time to move through the work, just like this piece here. These are cars shown at different moments as they're tumbling through space, like a film strip. So as we move through it, it's time-based. So this is a great example of that sense of sculptural installation being time-based. Sculpture is also unique because it offers a three-dimensional embodied experience. Instead of an image on the wall that we only see with the eye, sculpture is encountered with the whole body. We're immersed in it. Here's a great example of being immersed in the sculptural installation with the body. And Nick Cave engages the body directly with his wearable sculptures. They're costumes that transform the wearer into a work of art. And so he'll put these sculptures on and dance in them and move in them and become the work of art. So the body is extremely important to sculpture. An interesting part of installation art is that artists today sell experiences sometimes rather than objects. There are artists who create these theatrical experiences instead of a precious object. Now, there are still artists who create precious objects, many artists who do that. But some of those who create installations do so in order to resist the commodification of art. They don't want to be part of the capitalist system. They don't want to make objects that they will sell, but then how do they make money? Some installation artists create these installations paid for by the institution. They're paid by the institution to create the work. There are other installations that can be purchased, so this could be purchased by an institution. And along with installation, there is site-specific art. And that is art that cannot exist apart from the site in which it's created. Now, if we think back to the stained glass, the stained glass is created site-specifically, right? It cannot exist apart from the religious site in which it exists. Again, like I said, if you took it out and put it in a museum, it just wouldn't be the same. It's meant for our community, and it's meant for the rituals associated with that community. Then modern sculpture is taken out of the site, and it's taken out of context and put on a pedestal. And the site is supposed to disappear so the work can be contemplated all on its own. But artists weren't completely satisfied with this. So then artists wanted to return to the physical qualities of a location and the site specificity to not just remove the art from the site, but have it be intimately connected from the site. So Spiral Jetty does this. It's in Great Salt Lake, and it cannot be removed. Same with Lightning Field by Walter de Maria from 1977. These stainless steel poles are in a field intended to capture lightning when it strikes. Or Christo and Jean-Claude's Running Fence. They create a lot of sculpture, a lot of site-specific work that exists temporarily in the site and can't be removed. Richard Serra, a sculptor, public work, created Tilted Arc, and it wasn't very popular. And he argued, though, that it could not be removed from its site because it was site-specific, and if it was removed, it would be destroyed because it is specific to that site, and apart from that site, it cannot exist. But it was obtrusive. It was obnoxious. It blocked people's walk across the plaza to work, and so eventually it was removed. So his argument in that case was maybe not as strong. So installation art, as I mentioned, has this desire to resist commodification. So this work cannot be bought and sold, for example. And another kind of art that resists commodification is art that conducts an institutional critique. So Fred Wilson's piece, Mining the Museum, is an institutional critique, and he actually takes objects from the museum and rearranges them to show either their historical biases or the biases of the museum collection. And so in this case, he's taking cigar store Indians facing Native American picked photographs of Native American Marylanders. So he's revealing something about the museum to us and showing its hidden racism, but at the same time, the museum itself is paying for this institutional critique, so it makes one wonder how effective that critique could actually be if it's paid for by the museum. But in this case, the artist is no longer an object maker. And you may remember our discussion of this gentleman, Marcel Duchamp, who also argued that the artist did not need to craft new objects. He said that artists could take manufactured objects and place them in a gallery. They could be manufactured by somebody else, but if you, as the artist, place it in the gallery, it can become art. You do not need to make it on your own. So the question to consider is, how important is it for an artist to make his or her own work? And how important is the labor or the craftsmanship of the work of art? It's a question for you to consider, to think about. But it's interesting to see that there's a lot of art that's not crafted by hand anymore. So to continue this focus on sculpture, sculpture often entails processes that require more than one person. One person can't execute. So Charles Ray, he cast this father figure, and it requires industrial casting processes. He can't just do it on his own. He needs a whole crew of people. Anish Kapoor conceived of Cloudgate in Chicago, but again, a team is required to build it. His piece is so big that it begins to be in the realm of architecture. Just as an architect designs a building and someone else builds the building, an artist can design a huge sculpture and other people can build it. That seems to make sense, right? And what about new technologies? Now, even textiles can be produced digitally, just like this piece, as you can see here, was produced. So is it enough for the artist to have the idea and for someone else to execute it, or for something else to execute it, to create the work? Can a machine create the work and it still be a work of art? which is part of this craftsmanship dilemma. Charles Ray, same artist who created this piece, deals with this question with hinoki. He hired expert Japanese craftsmen to carve this piece. It is a replica of an oak log that he found, but it's carved in cypress wood. The work is highly crafted. It took 5 years to construct, to create by these skilled craftsmen. But the artist hired the craftsman to execute his vision. So what is the difference between fine art and craft? Part of the division is between things that are functional and things that are not functional. So you can see here these examples of craft in your text are all functional objects. But at the same time, the art in your book that is craft, they call it craft, is also used to convey a message. It's not just functional. And in fact, this table is not very functional because the curve of the top makes it a little bit non-functional. So craft is also associated with certain media, wood and metal and fiber and ceramics. These artisans are working within these long traditions developed around these media. And for that reason, they're craftspeople. So there was this division, as I mentioned, after the Enlightenment, basically, after the Renaissance, Enlightenment, this 18th century, this division between art, fine art, high art, the art you associate with art, such as sculpture and painting, and craft or low art, as some people would call it. So there was this division that was set up, and a hierarchy that was set up. But as early as the 19th century, there were those who tried to reunite craft and fine art. William Morris is an example. This is a textile from 1892, and he created a design company with the intention of creating beautiful things that could be accessible to more than just a few elite. He wanted to spread the love. He wanted art to be accessible to many, many more people. And this desire to reunite art and craft and to question that division between art and craft was continued by feminist artists in the 1970s, such as Miriam Shapiro. They brought traditional feminine crafts into their art. She's uniting painting with traditional fiber art. Textile arts were often associated with women. Perhaps one of the reasons that they're seen as lesser arts because they're associated with women. Faith Ringgold made story quilts. She tells stories such as this one based on her life growing up in New York with quilts. Another artist who unites fiber art and painting is Polly Apfelbaum. She questions the priority put on painting and the denigration of textile arts. Her pieces are like abstract paintings, but they're made with fabric and with dye that she hand dyes. They're put on the floor. They remind us of rugs, and they create this newly embodied experience. So they're like paintings, but they're also like rugs. They're like paintings that have fallen on the floor, as if the paint is filling the space and splashing across the floor. And she's also elevating fiber art to so-called high art, questioning the division between high art and craft in the first place. So that division is being questioned. And what's interesting is that her work is not so different from this textile, which is like a garden. It's flowers, and if you walk on this carpet, it's like you're walking on an indoor garden. You're having a sort of similar experience to Polly Apfelbaum's piece. And what's also unique about it is that it's extremely labor intensive. This took 25 million individual knots to create. So there's something very impressive about that human labor, even though Marcel Duchamp would argue that the artist does not need to craft the work of art. There still is something impressive about that labor that makes the raw material valuable. So we've come a long way since the 12th century. And today, artists have many options. They can take on many identities. They can be craftspeople, but they can also create installations and hire people to help make their work. And the main question, the main challenge for the artist today is simply finding out where he or she fits within this world of art.